all, Violet here, second generation homeschooling mom of 3. I have a 9-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a toddler. Today I wanted to do a comparison video for History Quest and Story of the World. So let's get into it. So now that we've used each of these for a while, I wanted to do a comparison video and kind of highlight differences between the two, pros and cons of each. So we've used History Quest for early times, middle times, and then we're using the US volume in addition to the 3rd and 4th volume of Story of the World. So we're replacing the US chapters in the 3rd and 4th volume of Story of the World with the History Quest chapters, if there are History Quest chapters, because Story of the World covers a little bit more US history than History Quest US does. So my plan for this video is, first I'm actually going to talk a little bit about the 4-year history cycle, which is what we prefer to follow. Then I'm going to go through the student books and compare them for all the levels. And then I'll go through the activity books, and then I'll talk about some general pros and cons of each. So the 4-year history cycle, what is it and why does it matter? So the 4-year history cycle comes from The Well-Trained Mind, which Susan Weisbauer, the author of Story of the World, wrote The Well-Trained Mind as a guide to a classical education. Technically, it's neoclassical because you're not trying to learn Latin and Greek so that you can read the classical fathers in Latin and Greek. It's more of a great books kind of idea. But anyway, in The Well-Trained Mind, Susan Weisbauer gives you instructions for pulling together resources to create your own curriculum. So she also has recommendations for specific curricula in there, but kind of the bulk of this book is, if you want to do history yourself, here's the kinds of things you focus on. Here's suggestions of people, here's suggestions of how to do it, how to set up your history notebook, how to organize it, all of that. And the 4-year history cycle comes from that this neoclassical education history is the backbone that you organize the rest of your subjects around. So if you're in the early stage, the grammar stage, you're going to go through all of world history once. And so your first year, you're doing ancient history, you're doing the ancient science, which I think is biology or something. I don't really like organizing science that way, but whatever. And you're pulling in literature and music and art that corresponds to the time period you're studying in history. And that is really reflected in the way that she wrote this curriculum. So we'll get to kind of how that plays out in a little bit more detail later. But essentially, the 4-year history cycle is a way to organize history to make sure that you cover everything you want to cover at least twice before you get to high school. So in 1st through 4th grade, you go through ancient, middle, early, and modern times, and then you do the same thing, but at greater depth, and hopefully making a lot more connections between things the second time you go through in 6th through 8th grade. There are other history cycles out there. There's a 3-year history cycle. I think Chronicles uses the 3-year history cycle. So every 3 years, they go through all of world history and American history in 2 separate strands. Different Charlotte Mason programs split it up in different ways. I think Ambleside Online does a 6-year rotation. At the end of the day, I don't think the kind of history rotation you do matters a whole ton. It's really just a way to organize all the resources you're pulling together. And if you really are DIYing everything like this, all of your other subjects are based off of history, so it's really important to the order in which you cover things in history. If you're not building your own curriculum like that, the order that you do history in matters a lot less because you're not basing everything else you do off of how your history is going. So for me personally, I do like the 4-year cycle. I feel like it's an appropriate amount of time to spend at each grade level, kind of on those things. And then we're in the US, so high school is kind of a big demarcation. So by the time my kids are in 8th grade, they'll have gone through world history and US history twice, and then they can jump in to more in-depth topics in high school. But yeah, at the end of the day, I don't think it matters a ton what kind of history cycle you use, as long as you have a clear idea of how you're going to cover everything you want to cover in history, both kind of at a younger age and then more in-depth at an older age. So if you want to read more about the kind of why behind the 4-year history cycle and how that all plays out with all the other subjects, you definitely will want to read this. And I do think if you're going to use Story of the World, skimming The Well-Trained Mind at the very least before you start is going to help you understand all the different components of Story of the World a little bit better. So now we're going to take a look at the student readers. So for History Quest, this is designed to be an elementary curriculum that covers 4 years. And they're not quite done with it. So the 4th year Modern History Bridge uses an encyclopedia, I think the Esborn Encyclopedia. And then it also uses the 4th volume of Story of the World. The first 2 volumes are intended for grades 1 through 6. U.S. history is intended for 3rd plus, and that's more because of heavier themes than any particular writing style or activity guide stuff or anything. And then Modern History Bridges are 3 through 7. All of the History Quest books are set up the same way, all of the student readers. So this first one has 26 chapters, and in every chapter there's a main reading, and then there'll be a history hop that takes you back in time. You meet someone who lived at that time, and it's a lot more like a story. It's a little bit more immersive. And there's maps and pictures all in black and white throughout this study guide. So that's how all of them are set up. Middle Times has 28 chapters, but it's set up the same way, where you've got the main part of the chapter that has kind of the overview, the narrative overview of all of the history. And then you have the history hop, where you're going back in time and meeting someone specific and learning about something specific. So my kids particularly enjoyed the history hop, but they've done well with the narrative portion as well. Actually, my youngest didn't. He was really little when we started this, so he sort of listened to the narrative for a little bit in Ancient Times, but he didn't really get a lot out of it. And then he really just listened to the history hops for Middle Times. And then History Quest US, again, set up the same way, where they've got the main part of the chapter, and then they have your history hop. And in history hop, they'll show you exactly where you're hopping back to. And you meet someone specific and learn about them. So these 3 books, I will say, they feel like they're all written at about the same reading level. This one might be ever so slightly simpler in terms of sentence structure, but in general, I feel like these are all written at the mid-elementary level. In general, my kids have enjoyed these. I personally was a bit disappointed with History Quest US. I don't know if you're going to be able to see this, but it's written for an older grade level than the other volumes, but it's shorter. It's covering US history. It has 26 chapters, but the individual chapters are shorter than the chapters in Early Times and in Middle Times. So the audiobook is a bit shorter. The actual history text in here, instead of being 500 pages, is 470 pages. And I was a bit disappointed by that. I was expecting the length to increase a little bit from year to year. And I do feel like History Quest US is a very brief overview of US history. It's part of why I opted not to do it as its own year. I feel like it just skips too much, and my kids don't have the world history background to understand all of this stuff in context. Like, there's no chapter on World War I. There's a paragraph about it in the Great Depression chapter, kind of introducing, like, after World War I, which was a terrible war, then there was the Great Depression. But I don't know, I just felt like it left a lot out. And so even though we really enjoyed these first 2 volumes of History Quest, I decided to use this in conjunction with Story of the World for early modern and modern, because I really didn't feel like this was enough on its own. So here's the Story of the World 4-year cycle. Again, it's ancient, middle, early modern, and modern. Each of these volumes has 42 chapters, but again, I don't know if you're going to be able to see this. They increase in size each year. So the chapters are getting a little bit longer, especially this 4th volume has a bit of a jump. It's a little bit hard to see because these 2 are hardcovers. These are the ones I own, and these are from the library. The chapters are getting a little bit longer each year, and that's reflected in the writing style as well. So in this first volume, this is set up in chapters, and each chapter has 1, 2, or 3 kind of sub-chapters that tell stories that happened during that time period. And so it's written like a narrative, and each chapter in this uses fairly short, fairly simple sentences. This is definitely written at a younger level. So this is supposed to be for grades 1 through 5. This one, the sentence structure and the amount of information in each chapter gets a little bit harder. And so this is written for grades 2 through 6. This volume gets a little bit, this is my list of things that are included in this that aren't in History Quest US. Again, in this one, the sentence structure gets a little bit harder. The amount of information is a little bit more. It's a little bit more complicated. And then this one, and so this one is for grades 3 through 7. And then this one's intended for grades 4 through 8. And again, it's just more complicated. The level that it's written at is higher. The amount of information they include is more. The sections are a little bit longer. All of that. So these, I feel like, scale really well, that they're increasing in difficulty a little bit each year. Now, when we're comparing these to History Quest is entirely secular, and they make a point to try to bring in voices that you don't normally hear from in history. So there's a lot of history hops that you're meeting a famous woman, or in the US history, you're meeting a minority or someone with a disability, a person of color. And I really appreciate that about History Quest, and that is not so much the case in Story of the World. Story of the World is, I would say a lot better than most public school history curricula, but it's still fairly standard in terms of the kind of people you're meeting. For example, my husband's Colombian, and so I gave him, when we were trying to decide what history to use after finishing History Quest, I gave him this volume to look at the sections on Colombia and kind of get his feedback. And he said that they were in general good, but they focus on Simón Bolívar a lot and they cut out a lot of the figures around him, which is probably intentional for simplifying the narrative so a kid can follow it. But one of the characters they cut out is La Libertadora del Libertador. And she's a huge folk hero in Colombia. She pushed Simón Bolívar out a window so he could escape, essentially. Or she helped him escape out of a window. And so that he didn't get captured at a very pivotal moment in Colombian history. And that's just a story that I feel like History Quest, if they ever actually get to writing this time period, would highlight in a history hop, or at least mention the chapter or something like that. And she's not in here at all. So that's kind of the difference in perspective between these two series. History Quest is much more progressive. I don't think Story of the World is irredeemable, at least the later two volumes. You can add those things to it. But one of the questions I ask myself when I'm evaluating curriculum is, if something happened and I had to do the bare minimum with this curriculum, what is the bare minimum that I would be happy with? And so for me, I would be happy with my kids just reading History Quest, the student reader. And if we didn't get to anything else, that would be fine. With Story of the World, I would still feel the need to pull in some additional resources, which again is not insurmountable, but just something to consider if you're comparing the two. So these last two volumes are totally secular. They're a little bit whitewashed. I notice it especially in the US history sections, and I'm not sure if that's just because there's more in those sections or just I'm able to recognize it better. And it is a little Eurocentric. Susan Wise Bauer has said in other places that when she was writing this curriculum, because there's so much history in the world and she did have to make choices when she was writing it, she chose to prioritize times when events and countries had a broader global impact. And what that ends up meaning in these last two volumes, that for some countries, you hear more about how, like Japan and China, you hear more about how they interacted with European powers than what was going on internally. All right, these first two volumes. These volumes are not fully secular. So this first volume includes some biblical stories here and there, but they're in their own chapters. So if you don't want to include those, or I've heard some complaints, again, we didn't use this volume, so I've just kind of skimmed it a little bit, but I've heard some complaints that they don't like the way Susan Wise Bauer tells these Bible stories. She is a Protestant, and so she retells them through kind of that lens. So you could very easily skip or substitute these chapters if you're not happy with the way that they're presented. And so when she has a story in here, she'll have it inset like this. And that's less apparent, I think, if you're listening to the audiobook. She does have a little bit of text here. The book of Genesis in the Bible tells us about Abram. And then here's the story. But if you're reading from this, it's very easy to see that all the stories are inset like this. So for example, this Greek story, here's one of the stories from the Odyssey, has this formatting as well. And then here's this formatting again. I did just want to point out, it says their holy book, the Rig Veda, told the Hindus a story about how life began. So this book is assuming that the people reading it are not Hindu. At the time when she wrote this, most homeschoolers were white Protestants. But yeah, I don't love that. Okay, and then the other thing that I wanted to point out is there are places in here occasionally where she is telling a story about a historical figure, and that story is of dubious authenticity, and those sections are not formatted like stories in this volume. She did recently announce that she was going to go through and update all of these for their 25th anniversary, and so one of the changes that she is making is that now stories like this about famous people that are of dubious authenticity will be inset like stories. So it's really clear that those portions may not actually be historical. They're stories we tell about those people. So this is the sample of the updated ancient history. It's the only one that's available right now. And I went through, I was curious. I wanted to know how much had changed. And they don't have all of these in the sample, but what I read from these sections, there are very, very few changes. She did add these History Maker sections, which are essentially short biographies. They're just a few pages, but they introduce some famous people that were omitted the first time she was writing this that she really felt like probably should have been included. Most of them are men. There's one that's about a king and queen, and then there's one that's about a woman. And then she rearranged several of these sections to make them more chronological as opposed to grouped in regions, but most of these subchapters didn't change at all. These two, the names changed. And then these 2 chapters were added entirely, Troubles in China and Lands East of China. So it talks about Korea and Japan as well. I will say they also said in the update that some of the sections they're adding more information to, and that just isn't reflected in these chapter headings. So I read through here, and a couple of things that I noticed changed. In this first chapter, this used to say 7,000 years ago, or about 7,000 years ago, or something like that. She's changed that to thousands and thousands of years ago, talking about the first nomads. This is some inset that they've added that I was talking about earlier. Just things like that. Mostly, I noticed formatting. This is one of the biographies. You can see it's pretty short. But yeah, they have this free sample on their website that you can download if you're interested in the updated story of the world. So I still would not consider the updated one secular. Obviously, they haven't really changed any of that stuff. So Volume 2, Middle Times, I would also consider not strictly secular, and that's more just in the way that she describes some of these things, like particularly Augustine coming to England and evangelizing. And the chapter on the Reformation as well is definitely from a Protestant perspective, but that is something that you could edit while you're reading if you otherwise like this curriculum and don't prefer that as well. Another thing I will say about this volume, again, I only skimmed it, but I did notice it tended to be a bit Eurocentric in the way it phrased things. And what I mean by that is, for example, when they're talking about the Crusades, they talk about how the knights were brave, for example. But then when they're talking about the Muslim warriors, they talk about how they were warlike. And just kind of that difference in emphasis is not great. I would prefer it if we treated all of the warlike figures in a similar manner instead of kind of dividing people up into better and worse. Yeah, I don't like that. This does also get into some of the age of exploration. And like I said earlier, I prefer the way History Quest handles that. All right, let's take a look at the student activity books. You can see I mostly have printouts, and that's because I prefer to buy the PDF version. I think it's a lot easier to print all the student pages from the PDF than having to photocopy them from the hardcover. I ended up with this hardcover because I bought it used and it was significantly cheaper to do it this way, and I did not enjoy photocopying all the student pages. So History Quest, the study guides are for the first 3 levels. Modern History Bridge is different, but the first 3 levels are set up pretty much the same way. So the table of contents shows you all the chapters, and it also shows you where you insert the special Hygge History Weeks, which is a feature that History Quest has that Story of the World does not have. So these weeks, instead of reading from the main book, you're going to spend the whole week reading a longer piece of literature. So Early Times has 4, Middle Times has 4, US History has 5, and then 2 Research Quest weeks as well, which we'll look at when we get there. So this is the free sample you can download, by the way. It's a pretty good look at everything that's in here. So every week has a little overview of what you're doing that week with the main point of what you're learning, all the things you need. So this will list if you need to have a map page because there isn't one for every week, and any supplies that you'll need for any of the activities. So on this page, they have a schedule if you want to split it up over 5 days. We do not do that. We do history 3 days a week. And so when we were doing Early Times and Middle Times as well, actually, on day 1, we'd do our chapter reading, our map work, and then we'd look at the pictures in our history encyclopedia. On day 2, we'd do our history hop, and my daughter would color the history hop page while she listened. She would just do other coloring on this day. We would do our timeline, which we did instead of the travel log. And then we'd look at pictures in our art history encyclopedia. I have a resources video that has a flip through of the history encyclopedia and the art encyclopedia that I like, that I'll link down below if you're interested in those. And then on day 3, we did our review and activity. And then we would spread the enrichment reading throughout the week. And obviously when my daughter was in 1st and 2nd grade, I was mostly reading those picture books to her. Now that she's a lot more independent, she mostly reads them herself. And then it has terms and concepts, the big ideas from all the sections, some additional details. And then it has detailed plans for what you're doing each day, which again, we just pulled the pieces that we were doing from. For days that you have a map, they will list for you all the things that your child needs to label on the map. My daughter was not up for labeling this many things when she was in 1st and 2nd grade. So what I would do is actually photocopy these pages and put them with the map in her binder so that we could just cut these out and glue them onto the map. She would put them where they would go and I would glue them for her. And then they have instructions for the activities down here. This Early Times year was the only year where my daughter chose to do the activities more often than not. By the time we got to Middle Times, she was kind of overdoing activities and we didn't do a lot from there. And then they have several different ways to demonstrate. And the way that I would use this is we discuss these things for our review, and then she would do this sentence for copywork. And she was capable of doing this in first grade, this length of sentence. My son, who isn't doing ancient history in first grade, he'll be doing it in second grade just because of how his age lines up with the history rotation that my daughter is doing. I'd like to combine them. And she's doing modern times this year, and I really want him to start at ancient times. I think it's a lot to jump right into modern times. So he'll start history next year when my daughter is doing ancient times, and they'll just do it together. Anyway, all that to say, my son in first grade would not write this long of a copywork. I personally feel like this length of copywork is a little bit long for many first graders, although like I said, my daughter was totally able to do it. This is definitely for much older kids. We are planning to cycle back through these books again, but I don't think we'll be using this copywork because we'll be doing more in-depth writing. So that's early times. And middle times is set up the exact same way. I forgot to mention that these PDFs are all in color. I don't have a color printer though, so all of my printouts are black and white, but it is all in color in here. And it's set up the exact same way with the schedule, all the instructions for everything, and then the copy works as well. Here's an example of a Hygge week. They give you several different options to choose from, and then on the following page, they tell you a little bit about each option so that you can choose the one that will be the best fit for your family. And then here's US history, and this again is set up the exact same way. Labeling things on a map, and then the copy work is very similar. The easier copy work, there are a few longer sentences this year, I noticed, but they're all still a single sentence, and then the more complicated copywork is several sentences. This year, they also add 2 research quests, and so the first one is about a Native American nation near you, and they give you some resources to research things, and then you either can research it and present it in the way that you choose, or there's a worksheet at the back. So this would be the worksheet that you would fill out. And my daughter chose to do the worksheet rather than do a poster or a pamphlet or any of the other options I presented her. So this is an example of the travel log, which we do not use. One change that they did make for this year is the History Hop illustrations for US history are a full page. In the early and middle times, they were half a page each. And I think that's because then they would fit if you wanted to glue them to the travel log page, or if you wanted to use a primary journal like this, which I know a lot of people do like to keep a record of their history. And this way you could glue the History Hop page up here and then have your copywork down here. We've never done it that way. We've just kept all of our stuff in a binder. If you're interested in what our binder looks like, I did a video walkthrough of what our binder looks like for this year when my daughter's doing modern history. And it's been very similar in years past. So I'll link that down below if you're interested. But they did change this to be a full page. And here's one of the maps. It's just blank. They want you to label a bunch of stuff. I feel like for many kids, that would be, especially at the younger grades, too much writing. So again, I would photocopy those pages, cut the terms out for my daughter, and she'd place them where she wanted them glued, and then she'd do whatever coloring it told her to do, and that worked really well for us. One other thing that I wanted to point out is that they'll have an enrichment reading list that's just a few books long, and these are all early elementary picture book type reading for the most part, these enrichment lists. And there's one of the appendixes in the back is a list that you can print out that has all the readings for the year. So I always print that out and put that in my planning folder so that week to week I can just pull that list out instead of having to flip through this book or even flip all the way to the end every week. So Modern History Bridge is intended to bridge the gap between the History Quest series as it stands right now and Pandia Press's curriculum for older kids, History Odyssey. History Odyssey, I haven't used it, I haven't examined it in depth or anything, but from the samples that I downloaded, I didn't find it particularly appealing. It was written a while ago, and I just really don't like a lot of the books that they chose for the spines. They've updated some of their levels to use the History Quest books as alternate spines, but for us, I think it makes more sense to just use all the History Quest resources we have, and then I'll, on my own, pull in extra things for my daughter to kind of level it out for her. So harder reading, more writing, whatever I feel like she needs to bring it up to the level that she's studying at now. Anyway, let's take a look at Modern History Bridge. So Modern History Bridge is trying to take all of the subjects that they haven't covered in early modern and modern history and go through all of them. In Middle Times, they do include some things that Susan Wise Bauer, for example, includes in early modern times, like their chapter on the Mughal Empire covers the whole thing instead of just the first half. I personally feel like, yes, they did include some early modern topics in Middle Times, and then they do include some here, but it feels like a very superficial overview of early modern history to me. And I feel like early modern history is really important to understand in order to understand modern history. Is it a huge deal for kids to have a superficial understanding of that time period if they're just studying at the elementary level? Probably not, but it definitely is not what I am looking for when I'm looking at a history curriculum. So while I do think it's good that they have Modern History Bridge while they're theoretically working on their last volume of History Quest, I just don't foresee a situation in which I would recommend that somebody buy this instead of just buying Story of the World and then supplementing the areas that are missing. And I say theoretically working on because they did announce that they were working on a Modern Times volume, but that was a long time ago. The History Quest Ancient Times was published in 2019. Middle Times was published in 2020. US was published in 2022. And since then, they've been working on modern history, but there have been no publishing updates. And the author, Lindsay Sedano, who wrote Middle and US, has published the whole ELA curriculum in the intervening time period. So this is pure speculation, but I feel like they may have shelved that project for now. They use the fourth volume of Story of the World for most of this. The first few lessons use the encyclopedia because there are topics that aren't in the fourth volume of Story of the World, but then a lot of the rest of this is just coming straight from the fourth volume of Story of the World. Yeah, so this formatting is a little bit different than the History Quest volumes. I find this suggested weekly schedule kind of funny. I probably shouldn't because it is helpful to know that you do one lesson each week, but that's all this schedule says is just do one lesson each week. There's 36 lessons and it'll take you 36 weeks. Anyway, so the formatting here is for each lesson, they tell you what to do in your history notebook. They tell you what reading to do. If there's map work, they'll tell you what to label. They have suggested videos, and then they have some additional reading, and then it moves on to the next lesson. And you can see there's a lot more additional reading here than in the History Quest volumes. I assume you are also supposed to pick and choose, just like you do in History Quest in the student guide. History Quest does actually have video links and stuff. You just have to go to the Pandia Press website. I don't think I mentioned that earlier, but they do have like online links for all of the History Quest volumes. But yeah, the maps are set up the same way where they give you a list of stuff to label and then you have to label it all. I do feel like by the time a kid is doing this Modern History Bridge, they most likely will be able to label that much on a map. That's a little flip through of the Modern History Bridge sample. Okay, so here are the Story of the World activity books. Again, I only have a black and white printer. These do have color covers, but then the insides are all black and white. And these are all the free samples that you can get on their website. The fourth book the free sample is gigantic. They give you a lot of material to look at. But these, like the student readers, level up in difficulty from year to year. I don't remember if I mentioned this earlier, but Story of the World also has 42 chapters per year, which I find a little bit awkward just because you have to figure out which weeks you're going to actually do 2 chapters. And there are chapters that only have 1 subsection instead of 2, so they're shorter. So it's fairly easy to combine to get down to 36 weeks, which is what a typical school year is, but you do have to think about it a little bit, or I guess just run into the summer, whatever, however you do your homeschool. They have instructions about how to use this book, a pronunciation guide. So this is how each chapter is set up. They have encyclopedia cross-references up here, and then they have a review questions and a narration exercise for each of the subsections in the chapter. And for this level, there's 2 review questions and a very short narration that, and they give you an example of what kind of answer you should get. And then they have a few additional history readings, and they will tell you whether you should read it aloud or if it's something in the older levels that your child maybe could read independently. They also tell you if it's out of print but worth looking at your library anyway. And then they have a bunch of different activities to choose from. They try to have several different kinds of activities for each chapter. So this is a chapter that's farther on in early times, and so you can see already, even just across this volume, they've built in complexity. They have more review questions. They want a little bit more narration from the child, not a ton more, but instead of 1 sentence, now they would like a few sentences. And these review questions are to help facilitate the child then building that narration, which they talk about in the beginning of the book. And Susan Wise Bauer also describes that whole process in The Well-Trained Mind. And so the setup for this, I feel like, is a little bit less intuitive if you haven't read Well-Trained Mind, because it's not always immediately clear what each piece of this is for. But in The Well-Trained Mind, she describes her whole methodology for teaching history, which she then wrote this to fulfill. So here's some student example pages. Oh, another thing that I will say about Story of the World is the map exercises also scale in difficulty. So at this early level, there's a little script that you read for the map exercises, and it has your kid find things on the map. So instead of labeling things, it'll say something like, the Minotaur was in Crete. Find Crete on your map and color it blue. So I feel like this is a lot more developmentally appropriate map work than History Quest has. I was able to modify History Quest's map work to work well for my daughter, but I just really like the way they have map work set up in Story of the World a lot better. Then for my son, I may modify History Quest's map work to look more like this, where he's finding and coloring things instead of having to label stuff. All right, so this is book 2, Middle Ages. And it's set up the same way, 42 chapters, how to use this activity book, and then all the different things you can choose from. Here's an example of the map work. It's telling you what to color. I don't know why that starts in the middle of the page. It's the beginning of a chapter. So you can see this is chapter 12. There's a lot more review questions. I do not do all of these review questions with my kids. We also didn't use this level. We use the later levels, which have a lot of review questions. And I just use a few of them. I kind of want to get a sense that they remember kind of the most important things from each chapter. So I'll just pick out a few to do. We don't read through all of them. So one of the things that I really appreciate about Susan Wise Bauer's curriculum is that she never assumes you're going to use all of her curriculum pieces. So one of the complaints that I've heard from people is that this student activity book is overwhelming. It has so much in it. And it is. But that's because she includes in here everything you need to build a lot of the rest of your subjects, especially literature and all of your ELA pieces. So that's why there's so many review questions. There's narrations with everything. There's so many corresponding literature, especially in the older grades, so many corresponding literature suggestions, because she's assuming that you're going to use this history curriculum as the spine for all the subjects that you do. And so she needs to give you enough material that depending upon where your kid is at, you can pull stuff from here to build your literature curriculum, and to use that literature curriculum to then do all of your writing and grammar and all of your ELA pieces, which she describes how to do in the Well-Trained Mind. She's not trying to overwhelm you with all of those resources. They do have a point. It's just that if you're not using this curriculum for that, you're just using it for history, it's too much, and you need to cut a bunch of stuff out, and you need to know what you don't need, if that makes sense. That's also why she includes a lot of different activities for each lesson, because every family is not going to be doing every single thing. And also in some of the lessons, like in some of the later ones, she also includes math or science activities where it seems like it would make sense. So you can tie them into your math and science, which math not so much, but science theoretically would be going along with this history as well if you're following the classical rotation. We're eclectic homeschoolers, not strictly classical, so we don't set up our science that way, but that is how it's described in Well-Trained Mind. All right, so this is volume 3. And you can see that this does jump up a bit. There's a lot more review questions. The example, so this is one of these paragraphs is the example narration. And so it is longer. There's a lot more reading. One of the reasons that there's a lot more reading in this book is now kids are reading independently. And so she tells you if this is a read aloud or if it's independent reading. And she's also assuming when she wrote this curriculum that you would use it with all ages. So you'd use the same curriculum in 1st through 4th, and then you'd circle back around in 5th through 8th and just use the harder books. And so we absolutely do not do this much reading. I don't pick much from the nonfiction. My daughter likes these You Wouldn't Want to Be books, so I'll check those out. But she is not super interested in most of the other nonfiction readers, so I don't check them out. And I'll usually choose maybe 2 or 3 of these to check out, and then she'll choose maybe 1 or 2 of the ones that I checked out to actually read. Here's the map work. This is still finding specific things on the map and coloring them or tracing them. She's also now adding drawing arrows to indicate movements of things. Here's an activity project. Here's one of the science projects I was talking about. I actually don't remember if there are math projects in this level, but there definitely are in the 4th one. Here's the examples of the maps. Some of the coloring pages, which my kid did not use at all. This is what the child's version of the map looks like. Here's one of the activities, is making paper dolls, which, again, my daughter didn't want to do. And then this one now has review cards, which I thought maybe we could use these pictures as our timeline cards, but they're not dated, and I got really behind on looking up the dates for all of them, and we ended up not using them for the timeline. All right, this is the fourth volume's activity book, and this, again, is another step up in difficulty. One of the things that she now includes in this is writing exercises. There's outlining exercises for every subsection included in here. And partway through the year, the student transitions from filling in the outline to writing a paragraph from the outline. And that's all scaffolded in here, and they tell you how to do it. But encyclopedia cross-references, and then review questions. Here's the complete the outline, and this has replaced narration for this level. So this is the answer. The italicized portions are the answers they're looking for. The non-italicized portions are what's filled in on the student's outline. This first one has a lot blank because you're supposed to be doing this with your child to show them how to do the outline. The intention of the outline is to pull out the most important pieces of whatever you read. So the first ones are actually a little bit more blank than ones slightly farther on, and that's just because they're expecting you to do these with your kid. And then once your kid's a little bit more comfortable with outlines, they give the start of the sentence, and then your child has to fill in the rest of it. And I think there's examples in the student pages there. But yeah, tons of additional reading. The map work now in this 4th level switches to having you label things, but it's very few things. So I feel like this is a really good level of map work for this age of child. Lots of activities. They now have some co-op activities here and there. This book has these timeline figures at the end, and I printed these out really tiny. I think I printed 9 pages to a page to make our little timeline things. For History Quest, I got the audiobook for History Quest, and it comes with all of the book's images, and so I printed those book images 16 to a page to make our little timeline figures for History Quest. But yeah, these are really helpful because they're already dated, so that was really easy for our timeline. So here's an example of completing the outline. We didn't actually do this one because we used History Quest for Civil War, but essentially they've got the beginning of each sentence so you know what information you're looking for. I have my daughter listen to the whole chapter, and she colors whatever in her coloring book, and then after she's done listening, she'll get the physical text and she'll read through and look for the things she needs to complete the outline. Later on, you're now writing from the outline, and so they've provided an outline for you, and you need to write a paragraph or maybe paragraphs by this point. So the speed that we're going through these, we're doing an entire chapter in a day, so we do 2 chapters a week, and so I don't have my daughter do both outlines each day. I just have her pick one. And I'm assuming that we'll continue to. When we're writing from the outline, she'll just write from one of the outlines. She won't write from both because we'll be doing all of chapter 41 in one day. And she's also doing a separate writing program on top of that. And I want it to be an appropriate amount of writing, not a super overwhelming amount of writing. Okay, I also wanted to talk about the audiobooks. We use the audiobooks for these programs, which is great because then my daughter doesn't need to wait for me to be free to read it to her. The narrator for the History Quest audiobook we really liked. She's very calm while still managing to make it seem exciting. Like it's not so calm or monotone that it's boring. It's just almost soothing. It's very easy to listen to. We really liked the narrator for History Quest. We also like the narrator for Story of the World. It's Jim Weiss. And I know a lot of people do not like the way he narrates Story of the World. I grew up listening to Jim Weiss, his storytelling CDs, and my kids now listen to them as well. So they are already kind of used to his cadence. For his storytelling CDs, he uses a traditional storytelling cadence, which is fine for story CDs, but he brings it a bit into narrating the story of the world, and it's a bit much for reading a regular book to have that kind of sing-song cadence. But it hasn't bothered my daughter at all. She's enjoyed listening to audiobook for this as well. All right, so some general pros and cons, kind of summing everything up. So for me, the big pros of History Quest are that it is progressive. It focuses on voices that we typically don't hear from in history. My daughter really liked, she likes all of the history hops. The history hops are another pro, but she especially liked all of the history hops featuring women. The narrator on the audiobook is another pro for History Quest. We really liked her. Pros for Story of the World. I feel like the general writing style of Story of the World is a little bit more engaging. Like if we're comparing Story of the World's writing to the non-history hop portions of History Quest, Story of the World is a little bit more engaging. It's a little bit more like telling a continuous string of stories, whereas History Quest's overview portions do tend to feel a little bit, I wouldn't say they're dry necessarily, but they're a little jam-packed sometimes. But I definitely think some kids might just respond better to the way Story of the World is written. The other pro for Story of the World is that it's been around for a long time, so it's much, much easier to find really affordable copies of it used. And a lot of libraries have the student texts, and then it also on Hoopla has all of the audiobooks. I did buy the audiobooks because I didn't want to get into a situation where we were relying on the library's audiobook and then it was suddenly unavailable, and I wanted to buy it when it was on sale. So that's a big pro for Story of the World, is that I think you can use all the components relatively inexpensively. Another pro for Story of the World is that I think it does a really good job in both the student texts and in the activity books of scaling up in difficulty from grade to grade. I really like that progression. I think it's done really well. And I don't see the same progression in History Quest. It really does feel like all of the books are around the same level. It may get slightly more difficult, but not significantly. Another pro for History Quest is that it goes farther, closer to the present than Story of the World does. Story of the World was written, almost 25 years ago. And so the last chapter in here is the end of the 20th century with the First Persian Gulf War and independence in Africa. History Quest, on the other hand, goes all the way through September 11th up to some of the challenges and opportunities in kind of where we are now. One of the selling points of History Quest US is also that it incorporates civics. And yes, it does have some chapters dedicated specifically to civics, but I feel like Story of the World includes a decent amount of civics when they're covering American history topics as well. So that's kind of neither here nor there for me. I do like all the hygge stuff that they add for civics and everything in History Quest. Another pro for Story of the World is that I feel like it's a lot easier to age up for your kids because the activity books have so much stuff in them that already is kind of at a wider age range. Whereas History Quest, if you're trying to age it up, you're going to have to do a lot of that legwork yourself. So I do appreciate that about Story of the World. Oh, and another piece of that aging up is Story of the World also has test booklets that you can purchase. And they don't recommend them for younger kids, but if you want your older kids to have test-taking experience, either open book or closed book, they do have those test booklets available. So yeah, those are some of my pros and cons for History Quest and Story of the World. We have really enjoyed the combination that we've been using. It's been working really well for us, which is good because I put a lot of time into researching all the different options when we were getting to the end of History Quest. I was a little bit nervous about jumping into Story of the World because it is more whitewashed and Eurocentric. And that is true. It is more whitewashed and Eurocentric than History Quest. But I feel like of the options available to us, it was the best one. And I've been able to add with their independent reading books and other independent reading books that I've researched, I've been able to add some of the other voices that it's missing. On that note, I just have one more little digression, I guess. And that is, there is another secular history curriculum, Curiosity Chronicles, that is the least Eurocentric history curriculum of all of the kind of narrative style history curricula available. And we did give that one a try, and it was just a disaster for us. I've talked about this in other videos, but both of my older kids definitely have sensory processing differences. They went to OT for a while. I have sensory processing differences as well. And the dialogue style of Curiosity Chronicles was just a complete disaster for us. And it was so sad. I wanted my kids to like it. I thought it looked really cool. But the way that the dialogue in Curiosity Chronicles is written, it's very overwhelming to my kids. Like, it put them into sensory overwhelm and then sensory meltdown. And it was just really bad. But specifically the way the dialogue is written, at least in the small portion that we used, in the audiobook, you have one character giving you this whole paragraph, essentially, of historical information, and the other character will then interject with a question. And then it's back to the first character for another paragraph of information. And that kind of rapid fire back and forth dialogue is really hard on my kids' processing for several different reasons. One is that it's one character info dumping, the other character interjecting with questions. And so those constant interruptions are really hard on my kids' sensory processing. Part number two is then you have to keep track of who's speaking, because that does kind of change how they're talking about things. So that's another layer that they have to process. And then piece three is that the info dumping sections are pretty information heavy. Like so the audiobook did not work for us at all. It was way too overwhelming. When I tried reading a sample page straight through and removing all the dialogues, it just felt like I was reading an encyclopedia. It was very dry and it was not engaging for my kids at all, which was, again, such a bummer. I really wanted to love it. But yeah, it really didn't work for us. So I'm really happy that we found this combination that's been going really well. That's it for today. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. As always, I will link everything in the description box. I am an Amazon and Bookshop affiliate, so if you click on one of those links and make a purchase, I do receive a small commission. Thank you for watching.